You're listening to the STEMxm podcast, highlighting women in the fields of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And now, your host, Mel the Engineer.
Hello, and welcome to STEMxm episode 26. I'm so glad you joined me today for another peek inside the world of STEM research and careers. Joining us today is Jennifer Walker. Jennifer is a sea level and climate change researcher at Rutgers University. She investigates how sea level rise in the future will affect coastal communities. Through her work in oceanography at various labs, Jennifer has learned on a real-world level how the analysis of meticulously collected data can contribute to an understanding of sea level change that will in turn help coastal communities prepare for the effects of sea level rise. Jennifer earned a BS in Earth Sciences and Ocean Sciences from Duke University in 2014 and has since been working on a PhD in research in oceanography at Rutgers. So we're going to get right into the interview with Jennifer, and I'll join you again at the end to discuss show notes and also some important announcements about a couple things coming up for STEMxm. So stay tuned till the end. Welcome, Jennifer Walker, to STEMxm. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. So I just gave our listeners a look at your bio, kind of an overview. But to start us out, I really want to go back in time a little bit and chat with you about your kind of foundation. So could you tell us where you grew up?
I am from Media, Pennsylvania, which is a suburb outside of Philadelphia.
And were either of your parents in a science field or a STEM field at all?
No, they weren't actually. So I was kind of the first person in direct relation that I knew of going into the science path.
So what did your parents do?
My mom was in banking and my dad is a surgeon.
Oh, wow. Okay, so he's in the medical field.
Yes.
Neat. Okay, so when you were a kid, were you attracted to any particular science topics at a young age, or was that something that developed later?
I would say in general, even from elementary school, the bits of science we had at that stage, I was always really interested in. And that continued through into middle school and then definitely a lot in high school, where I became really interested in, biology and environmental sciences. And then what got me into specifically environmental and earth sciences, I was on an environmental science team called Envirothon, which really got me into the environmental sciences in particular.
That's too funny. One of my other guests mentioned Envirothon as well. So tell us more about your experience with that.
So it was just it was a small team. It was only 10 people. So you had 5 people on the older gold team and 5 people on the younger red team, which they would act as mentors for each other. So each person was responsible for a different category. So there was forestry, aquatics, soils, wildlife, and then a current issue. So I did the current issue aspect of the team, which changed every year. So one year, looking broadly at climate change or biodiversity or groundwater. So you'd have a different topic. And then there were competitions at our county and state and then national level, and then Canada participated as well. And it was a lot of teamwork of working all together. But I think what was really great about it was a combination of having a written component of the tests when we competed, but there were also a lot of hands-on components, especially with the soils and forestry. And then there was also an oral component. So there was an aspect of the competition at the state and national level where you had less than 24 hours with your team to put together a presentation working on some kind of a fictional community environmental problem. So I think that was really useful in, applying what we've learned, being part of being a part of this team, and then being able to speak about it in front of an audience is really useful later on when, now I'm doing research and talking about science and to different audiences, both, within my department and then broader public audiences. So it's really important to have those speaking skills as well to talk about what you're doing.
Absolutely. I could not agree more with that. So I want to come back to that topic, the communications topic, but let's keep going kind of with your timeline. So Envirothon was in high school, and then you went to college. Did you know what you wanted to major in when you got there, or was that something you kind of worked through taking your classes?
I knew when I went into college I wanted to do some kind of environmental or earth science. So I started taking some environmental science classes. I took a lot of geology classes, and I loved them from the very first semester. So I stuck with it and kept taking those, and then ended up majoring in earth and ocean sciences. So it's kind of a mix of geology and oceanography, which is basically what I'm doing now. It's kind of a mix of both of those as well.
Right. That's so cool. Okay, so did you go straight from your undergrad work into working on your PhD, or was there anything in between?
I did go straight from my undergrad into the PhD, yes.
Okay, did you do any undergraduate research?
Yeah, I did two of my summers during college. I worked at the University of Pennsylvania, and then while I was in college at Duke, where I worked as a research assistant, which then turned into an undergrad thesis during my senior year. And then I spent, Duke has a marine lab down at the coast in Beaufort, North Carolina, and I spent a semester there. And during that time, I spent a month out on a research cruise, where then I got into more of the oceanography side of research as well.
And how did you like that, being out for a month?
I loved it. Yeah, I had never spent one night on a ship. I had been on boats before, but we were out for 28 days straight with no land in sight. But I really, really liked it. There were only about 40 people on the boat, so you all get really close, and you have long days of working, but there aren't days off when you're out on a research cruise. But I think it was a really valuable experience. It teaches you about just being flexible in your work, and making the most of what you had. You only have the supplies you brought with you. So I think it was a very valuable experience, and I really enjoyed it.
That's awesome. So tell us a little bit more about how you got plugged into those types of opportunities. So you had these, great summer research experiences. How did you find those and get into them?
So my first research experience, the summer after my first year of college, I actually found through, you mentioned someone else who was on your show, Emily Moberg. We actually went to the same high school, and she started working with Doug Jarlmack at the University of Pennsylvania. And she knew that I was kind of getting into those kind of science fields, and she recommended I go visit and maybe spend some time with him and do some research. So that was actually my first research experience. And then from there, back at Duke, I just reached out to professors that I knew, and my undergraduate advisor, and said I wanted to do some kind of undergrad research. So I was able to find a lab to work in there. And then, so I think it's important to, if you're interested in something, you can just reach out to anyone and make the connections. People are really happy if you're interested in what they're doing, and to go talk to people, and you never know what can happen. You can set things up, which turn into great research opportunities.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. Specifically, that like you said, when you show interest in something that someone else is doing, and obviously they're really passionate about it, if they're doing research in it, then they're going to be probably pretty excited to talk to you about it. So that's a great point, and that's great advice. Okay, so let's get into some more recent years. So you're well into your PhD program at this point when we're recording. So what have you specialized in, and could you tell us about some of the projects that you've been working on?
So, broadly, I'm looking at sea level change in New Jersey. So, one of my main focuses is reconstructing past sea level. So we do that by using a proxy. And in our case, our lab uses mostly salt marsh foraminifera, which are these single-celled animals that live in about the top centimeter of salt marsh sediment. And they're really useful as a sea level indicator to reconstruct past sea level change, because these forams, different species like to live in different areas of marshes. So you'll find certain ones that like to live down in the tidal flats or low marsh, and then you get transitions into other species as you move up into the high marsh and kind of your upland transition. So you can look at the assemblages of these forams in modern sediment samples, and then that's kind of the first half of what we do, and then we look at the fossil environment. So we go out in these marshes and take sediment cores, look at the stratigraphy and describe the sediments, so we can get an idea of the history of the marsh area. And then in the sediments, we can analyze the fossil foraminifera. So they make a shell that gets preserved in the sediment, and they're very abundant. So we can go through these fossil sediments and look at the forams, and then based on what we found in the modern environment, with how they're distributed with your tidal elevation, we can apply that to our fossil sediments. And that's kind of broadly the techniques we're using to reconstruct past sea level. Okay,
so could you explain that word that you mentioned? I don't know that all the listeners would be familiar with stratigraphy. Is that what you said?
The stratigraphy?
Yeah.
So it's essentially just looking at the changes in sediments with depth. So when we're out in the field, then we take these sediment cores. It's all by hand. And we'll take out about 50 centimeters at a time, and we can core up to about 10 meters is the limit of this hand coring device that we use. But we take out these sections of sediment, and then this is kind of where the geology comes in, because you're looking at, you're classifying sediments and looking at the proportions of plant material and sands and silts and clays. So you're seeing how that changes with depth, and that kind of that becomes the stratigraphy then.
Okay, so this is almost like a more complex version of dendrochronology, right?
Yeah, it definitely is kind of like that. You're looking back in time through the sediments, just like you would with tree rings.
Okay, so I'm trying to picture this, and I imagine, because you're talking about tides, you would probably have to take core samples from different locations, like close to where the water line is, and then further out, and kind of piece it together that way as well, right?
So to describe the stratigraphy, we'll when we first go out to a new site, we'll just create transects, so just lines going across from the water's edge up to the upland where the trees are, and kind of, depending on how big the area is, every 20 meters, every 50 meters, we'll take another sediment core. And then you can describe those sediments. And when you actually go back, then look at the notes, we can draw up these stratigraphy diagrams where it all kind of pieces together, where you might have more organic, really peaty sediment for a few meters, and then it transitions into maybe a more silty sediment. And you can see how that changes and the depths of these different sequences change.
Okay, so I want to ask, I guess this is a slightly more technical question about how your research works. So you're looking at these specific species that live in a certain layer of sediment. Is that right?
So we're looking first. We look in the modern environment and see where these species are living. So just on the surface of the sediment, from the water down at the tidal flat up into your high marsh and then your upland tree environment.
Okay, so I want to paint a really clear picture of what it is that actually happens that gives you and your team information, right? So I'm imagining you guys and gals, you go and pull a core sample, and then when you look at the different layers, how do you know approximately the age of the layers? And then with these species that you're looking at, is it just a matter of counting them?
Yeah, exactly. So our end result, right, is we want a sea level graph. So our y-axis is our sea level change, and then our x-axis is time. So the foraminifera go into that y-axis, and you're going down the core and, exactly as you said, taking out centimeter slices and prepping them, and then looking at them under a microscope and counting the different numbers of species and recording that. And then you do that through the whole core. And then using what we learned from the modern environment, we can see how sea level has been changing. And then for that x-axis, for the age, we mostly use radiocarbon dating. So we'll pick out little bits of salt marsh plant species and get them radiocarbon dated, and that gives us our ages for that x-axis.
Okay, that gives me a lot better idea of it. Okay,
Yeah,
thank you for explaining that. Is there somewhere that you could direct me to online, maybe where I could see some of this, like maybe see inside the lab and a core sample, or maybe even a picture from a microscope?
There should be, I think, we have a Rutgers sea level website for our lab, which has a bunch of photos I know from the field, and I think there are pictures of the 4M species as well.
Okay, fantastic. All right, well, I'll get that from you, and I'll put that in the show notes so our listeners can see that as well. And I'll also I'll put in that really long phrase that you mentioned, the glacio-isostatic adjustment.
Glacio-isostatic adjustment.
Yeah. So
yeah.
Okay, so we'll put in a resource for that in the show notes too. Awesome. You're listening to episode 26 of the STEMxm podcast. I'm your host, Mel the Engineer, and today we're speaking with Jennifer Walker about Paleo-Oceanography and the changes in sea level rise over time. That's really fascinating. Okay, so who is behind this research? Like, who funds it, and what are they trying to determine, or what's the end goal for how they'll ultimately want to use it?
So the end goal for our sea level reconstructions is, there's a lot of talk, obviously, about climate change impacts in the future, and one of the biggest ones of those is sea level rise. So you can create these models to predict future sea level change under different climate scenarios. But to make those models make really good predictions, you need to have good data going into them. So we're kind of providing the data of past sea level to be able to go into these models. And we can see, looking back over thousands of years, how climate and sea level have varied in the past. And that gives us a better idea of how, under different climate scenarios in the future, sea level rise could change in different areas.
Okay, so since sea level rise is something that we haven't really discussed on STEMxm, I wonder if you could just walk us through some of the basics of what causes sea level rise?
Sure. So right now, we're seeing this accelerated sea level rise. And the two main things that are causing sea level rise globally, if you look over the whole world together, you have ice melt and glaciers melting, which literally just melting ice, putting the water in the ocean, you're raising sea levels. So that's a big contribution. And the second one is through thermal expansion. So we have these rising atmospheric temperatures globally, and that warms the water. And as water warms, it expands. So you have this thermal expansion factor. So it's a combination of your ice melt and your thermal expansion. But what's particular for the East Coast and especially New Jersey is we have these other components that are regional factors affecting sea level rise. So we actually have the land is sinking in the mid-Atlantic coast because there used to be a big ice sheet covering much of North America called the Laurentide ice sheet. And when that was there, it depressed the land. So that was north of New Jersey, and it caused New Jersey kind of to bulge up in the mid-Atlantic region. And since that ice sheet has melted tens of thousands of years ago, where the ice sheet was, the land is rising back up, and now the mid-Atlantic is sinking back down. So the land is trying to reach that equilibrium again. So we call this a relative sea level change because you're not changing the water level, but you're changing the land level. So it appears that sea level is rising even faster. Which is important because it still factors into what we're seeing as sea level rise on our coasts. So you have these big regional factors, and then you can also get other local factors. If you have a lot of groundwater withdrawal, a lot of places in Asia are having problems because if you're moving water from underground at very high rates, then you get more land subsidence or land sinking, which is another factor of relative sea level rise. So there's a lot that goes into it depending on where you're looking as well, besides just your ice melt and your thermal expansion, which are the biggest factors globally.
Right. Lots of moving parts. Thank you so much for explaining that. And I love that you brought up the groundwater withdrawal too, because we'll just mention really quickly that, groundwater is one of the main sources of drinking water that
Yes.
we use. And so we see that. I'm in Florida, and so we see that happening in Florida where, if you overpump from the aquifer, then you get the subsidence that you described, or, in the form of sinkholes here, which is of course, terrifying and destructive and all sorts of other things. So our activities definitely have real impacts on the environment around us. So, what other parts of your research and what you've learned, sort of looking back in time at these things, would you like to share with the public? Maybe that's not talked about, or maybe that's misunderstood.
I think kind of what we are touching on is that not always well understood is that sea level rise and climate change impacts will be global, but it's also very region specific. So when you're looking at, it's important to understand globally what kind of changes you can see overall, but when you're actually coming down and trying to make policy decisions or looking at specific communities, you really need that information about a region and locally as well. So I think it's important to kind of be, have the broad sense, but also that more narrow scope when you're thinking about climate change.
Can you speak to us about any other maybe unique examples that you've learned about, even if you haven't done research on it, but like you were describing with this sort of sinking that's happening that's causing a localized, exacerbated issue there in New Jersey?
Another example of a a more local factor?
Yeah, I mean, that's totally unique, and I'd never heard about that particular example. I wonder if you've heard about anything else like that has impacted a certain area, maybe that has also exacerbated sea level rise or some other aspect of climate change.
Yeah, I would say that so that process of the land sinking is called glacial isostatic adjustment.
Huh.
Um, so the fancy term for the sinking land that factors into sea level rise. But I would say that that's become more apparent and been factored into a lot of models now in the last couple of decades. I think the newest and biggest thing for me that I've learned about is how much groundwater withdrawal can have an effect on sea level rise. Um, and I was actually just at a conference last week, a big sea level conference in New York City, where there were a bunch of talks talking about this problem in Asia, and specifically in Indonesia and parts of Japan, where it's, the sea level is rising and the land is sinking to such an extent that parts of their communities and cities are below your mean sea level right now. So you're basically having to wall in these areas and be constantly pumping water out and away from these areas, which I just found, I wasn't aware that, a lot of this, because of groundwater withdrawal, could have such a huge impact. Coming back to just how humans can have a lot of impact without realizing it as well, and there can be a lot of longer term consequences.
Okay, Jennifer. So I want you to explain to us a little bit about the impacts that we're expecting to happen from sea level rise. So, kind of some of the things that coastal cities and states are thinking about as they try to plan mitigation efforts. What's going to happen? What do we expect to happen?
Right. So I'd say it's really important now to be looking at sea level rise because we've had sea level rise for several thousands of years, but now due to anthropogenic climate change and these increasing atmospheric temperatures, we have these accelerated rates of sea level rise. So it's important now and not several thousand years ago because we have such dense coastal communities, which are now at risk from the sea level rise. So, in the past, you could have all the sea level change, but if it wasn't necessarily directly affecting people. So now we have these increased rates and a lot of people who are at risk, especially big cities, which are very densely populated as well. So I think that Hurricane Sandy in 2012 was a important wake-up call in many cases. I think it got a lot of cities on the East Coast kind of talking about sea level rise as a more real threat and something that needed to be discussed because we could see what kind of impacts could happen. And that, it's just talking about our current sea level rise. So if a Sandy were to occur in another 50 years or at the end of the century when sea level could be a half meter, a meter higher than it is now, we could have a lot more devastating impacts. So, I'd say the biggest thing that we should all be doing is trying to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions because with, the carbon dioxide that's already in our atmosphere, we've already committed to a certain amount more of sea level rise because it's still catching up. So the sooner we start cutting back, the sooner we can kind of mitigate those impacts. But otherwise, in terms of, there's a lot of talk of hard structures kind of for more near-term solutions. Definitely along the coast in New Jersey, there are beach replenishments going on pretty much every year, sometimes more than one in a season, to build our beaches back up. So, I think it's important to talk about some of those solutions to act now, but you also need to be thinking about the longer term, which all kind of comes back to cutting our carbon emissions.
Right. Okay. So maybe now would be a good time to go back to talking about that communication piece for a moment. So you said that developing that has been really important to your work and to your research. Would you have anything that you would want to say to the skeptic community, as it were?
Yes. I would say that the skeptics kind of talk about climate change as a belief, but we're talking about facts. So they're true whether or not you think you believe in them or not. There's a documentary about sea level rise and Hurricane Sandy, and someone in it had a great kind of story, which if you go to 100 doctors, right, and 99 of them say that you have a brain tumor and one says that you don't, who are you going to believe? And you can directly apply that to climate change now, and that humans are causing it. If you go out and ask all of the scientists and look at peer-reviewed publications, everyone's going to say that climate change is occurring and that humans are causing it. And we have these accelerated changes happening as well. So I would say that in general, yeah.
You can listen to this episode again and all the other STEMxm episodes on iTunes, Google Play, or by visiting STEMxm.com and going to the respective episodes show notes page. I'm your host, Mel the Engineer. Thank you so much for downloading and tuning in. So let's say we've convinced someone. Suppose we've converted someone and we've got people in front of us who understand that, okay, we're making a lot of greenhouse gas from various different combustion sources, and they're going into the atmosphere. They're heating the atmosphere. But we also know a lot of it is sinking into the ocean, right? Because the ocean is a great sink for CO2. What if someone believes, let me rephrase. What if someone thinks that nature can kind of heal itself and adjust to our activities and our behavior?
I would say, we know the climate is always changing over Earth's history. You can get, all sorts of big swings in temperature and CO2. It is important now with the kinds of changes we're seeing and how quickly they're changing because of how populated our Earth is now. So if you want to say, oh, it'll correct itself, okay. But what about the people living here? Do we just do nothing to change that? If we know we're causing this change and it's hurting ourselves and our own species, shouldn't we be doing something about that?
Right. Absolutely. Okay. All right. I'm going to switch gears again. So going back to your own research, are there any other projects or specific problems that you've worked on that you would want to tell us about?
Yeah, I think so there are a lot of, along the East Coast, there are a lot of sea level records extending back about 2,000 years, which gives us, a good idea for sea level variability over that time period.
When you say
and one of the
when you say sea level records, what does that mean exactly?
So using the methods I talked about, using these proxies, these foraminifera, people who've created or reconstructed sea level in different regions along the east coast of the U.S.
Okay.
So one of the questions that I've been thinking about and my lab's been thinking about now is that longer term. So looking at longer term climate variability and sea level rise. So, if you have different slight lowering in temperature, such as during the Little Ice Age, or a bit of a rise in temperature, how much does sea level actually vary during those time periods? And then looking even further back in time, do you get the same sort of effects with different temperature scenarios? So that's definitely one of the questions. And then also tackling more of this regional difference in sea level history. So we see changes in the rates of sea level, kind of a difference below North Carolina and above North Carolina. So coming back to those regional factors, it seems like North Atlantic climate variability and then changes in ocean circulation also have a different impact on different regions of the coast and how sea level will change.
Okay, very fascinating. All right, so in your realm, you kind of get to touch several different areas: geology and oceanography, and then biology to some extent. If
Mm-hmm.
you were speaking to some younger students who, have some interests similar to yours in the environmental science sort of realm, or earth sciences, what what recommendation would you give to them? Maybe they're unsure of what to do in school, or they're unsure how to get on the right track.
Yeah, I'd say, definitely if they're choosing classes and that sort of thing, be very open. If something seems interesting, just go for it. I think the main thing also, which we kind of touched on earlier, is just, talking to people. And if you read online somewhere nearby to university and you think their research is really interesting, like send them an email or go talk to them. Um, and getting that experience talking with people and learning about other people's research um, can help give you an idea of what you're really interested in as well.
How would you define paleoclimatology and paleoceanography?
So paleo meaning the study of the past, essentially. So um, paleoclimatology being studying past climates, and then oceanography studying the oceans of the past, whether that be ocean circulation or temperature or just the general ocean conditions.
Your work kind of spans both of those, so that's really cool. It's
Hmm.
awesome. Are there any mentors that you've had along the way that have guided you in some specific way that stands out?
I would say early on when I was first getting into, the research, my undergraduate advisor, he I took a lot of classes with him. He kind of helped me find my first research position in college. But what was very engaging about him, his classes, he was extremely enthusiastic. And people who, he taught some basic intro geology classes, so just learning about rocks at the most basic level, which most people would think, why would I ever take that? It sounds very boring. But he became known as this just really, really great professor, and people would take his class just for him doing these, geology classes, which I think was really great. But he was, I think, really important early on for me when I was getting really interested in these kinds of topics and helping me kind of find the research path I wanted to go on.
That's fantastic. What was his name?
His name was Alex Glass. He's a professor at Duke.
You've done a lot of interesting work. What do you think is in store for you in the long run? You're going to earn your PhD, and then what do you think after that?
So yeah, I have about another 2 years probably of the PhD. I definitely really like the research. I think my ideal job would combine doing research and also have a large outreach component, because I really enjoy, you know, telling people about my research and just about science in general. I've tried to do, as much kind of outreach activities as I can during grad school now. So whether that's in academia or for a government agency, I'd really like to combine both of those, because I think it's important to get the science out to the public and not just be publishing papers that are, more dense and difficult to read, but translating that to the public, which can, most importantly, we want that to transform into policy decisions as well for the future.
Right. That's such a great point. I mean, you hit on two super important topics there, communicating to the public, and then also, having an influence to make sure that there's sound policy creation, science-based policy creation when it comes to things that are connected to the environment and protecting people and our health and everything like that. So I'm so glad you pointed that out. That's
Yeah,
great.
definitely. I think there has been and there still is a pretty big disconnect between the science and the policy. So I think there need to be more people trying to kind of bridge that gap.
Right. Do you have any thoughts on what we as a community of scientists and engineers can do to help change that?
To help bridge that gap,
Yes.
I think, the people who are interested in both or enjoy talking to the public should take those opportunities. And I think, some people might think, oh, if I'm a professor, I'm in academia, that's kind of just all I'm doing, writing papers and grants. But there are a lot of opportunities to work with the public and get your ideas out there. That was kind of the conference I mentioned that I was just at. That was another kind of big takeaway. There were other stakeholders there, and they were interested in hearing about the science, and it's important that we can communicate and work together.
Right. That's a great point. Okay, I want to go back to something you said just a moment ago. You said, I really like the research part of it. I think for somebody who doesn't have, someone in their network that is a professor or a researcher, they might have this idea in their mind that, someone who does research is in a lab all day long dealing with flasks and beakers and a Bunsen burner, and that's it. Like, that's the extent of the picture. Mm-hmm. So tell us what research looks like for you, and what aspects of it do you enjoy the most?
For me specifically, well, I first got into science when I was a kid because I love being outdoors and learning about the environment. So I really wanted to do research that had a field component. So, one of my favorite parts of my research is being able to get out, be outside all day, and doing that field work. There's a lot of travel involved. So that's a big part of it, of what I do. There is, of course, that lab component. There always will be that lab component. You have to, prepare and analyze your samples. But besides just being in the lab all the time, it's a lot of, back to that communication. I'm always in contact with other researchers talking about different ideas of how to, prep my samples or analyze them, and then, producing data in the end. So it's a combination of, especially for me, being in the field, being in the lab, and then always being in contact with other people, talking about all of your ideas.
That's awesome. That's a great answer. Thank you. Okay, so we're coming up to the end kind of my questions. So I'd really just like to kind of open the floor and ask you if there's any sort of thoughts or advice that you would want to give to young women that are looking to go into a STEM field.
Yeah, I would say, don't let anything hold you back. If you're interested in anything, you should go for it. I think it's really important to not only take any opportunities that are given to you, because you never know where they'll lead, but also, seek out those opportunities yourself. And if you think you might be interested in something, just go for it, because you never know. And then just, trying to connect with people. A lot of opportunities just come out of having one conversation with someone, and then it can turn into a whole project.
Awesome. That's great advice. Well, Jennifer, I want to thank you again for taking the time, and thank you for joining us here on STEMxm.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for downloading and for joining me today on STEMxm. You can find this episode's show notes at STEMxm.com/episode 26, and that's the number 26. For this episode, I put in a lot of great resource links for you to learn about marshes, the use of proxy species in science, stratigraphy, and several of the other earth science pieces that Jennifer discussed. So be sure to check that out. Okay, so what else is going on? I've connected with a group of women in tech. So if all the scheduling works out, I should have 3 to 4 episodes on the horizon that are geared towards software development and other career avenues in tech. I'm hoping to get those out starting a couple of months from now, so be on the lookout for those. The other big thing going on that I'm about to leave the country for a while to work on something really cool. Okay, so I was nominated by the Water Environment Federation, or WEF, and subsequently selected for a program called Unleash. This is the first year of the program, so I'm very honored to be selected. Basically, I'll be joining a group of other young professionals from across the globe in Denmark to work on solutions to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. If you'd like to learn more about this program, you can visit unleash.org. And I'm going to have a bit of a pause in the STEMxm episode releases around and during the time of this trip. So in the meantime, I'd love it if you would join me and follow along in my journey. I'll be posting about it on my different social media channels, so you can find those on Instagram, it's just STEMxm. On Facebook, it's facebook.com/STEMxm. And then on Twitter, the handle is STEMxm Podcast. Make sure you put the podcast at the end on there for Twitter, or you'll get the wrong account. Okay, thank you so much for your support and for your patience while I'm gone. I look forward to sharing my journey and also returning after the trip to publish some fresh new episodes for you. Thanks again, and I'll catch you next time on STEMxm.
This has been an episode of the STEMxm podcast. Thank you for listening. We would really love if you could pop over to iTunes and give us an honest, positive rating. It helps more listeners find us to learn about STEM careers. Thanks again, cheers, and we'll catch you on the next episode.